Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today I'm going to share with you how I paint my splashy ballerinas. Today I'm going to work on Stonehenge black watercolor paper, and this is a 100% cotton watercolor paper that has been around for a couple of years. There's also less expensive wood pulp black watercolor paper, and if you're just getting started and you want to try this technique, you can always use a thick black cardstock as well. When you're using metallic watercolor paints, they don't require quite the amount of water that you would use in traditional watercolors. I'm sketching on with a pastel pencil. This is in a peachy color. I figure I can wipe away anything that I don't like as far as lines or even erase it, but it will also just kind of integrate into my painting when I'm done. You could also use a piece of chalkboard chalk for this. It would work just fine. Just try not to scratch up your paper if you are using like a hard chalkboard chalk. Dressmaker's chalk, any of that stuff would work just fine. So I started off with the torso and the outstretched arm, the arm that's behind her, and I'm basically just trying to proportion everything so that it will fit in this paper. That's one struggle I have when I'm drawing people, is getting the, like if they're outstretched, getting the arms and legs to stay on the paper, because I tend to draw a little bit larger. And even purposely drawing a little bit smaller, I still reached the edge of everything. Now, some proportions to keep in mind. Generally, your lower leg is the same length as your knee to your hip, and your torso is the same length as your like hip to knee and knee to toe. So if you kind of keep that in mind, it's going to help you. It's going to help you divide up the body a little bit better. But there's no substitute for practice. So if you want to get better at drawing people, just draw people more often. That's what I've been challenging myself to do for the month of October. I've been drawing a different person every day. Sometimes more than one if I'm doing like a bunch of sketches. But I'm coming out with one finished picture every day. So if you want to check me out on Instagram, I've been posting those photos there. You don't have to be super detailed with this because you're going to be doing a lot of the detailing with your paints, so don't worry about that. Now I'm holding my paper up when I do that because it helps to see the artwork without a skew, because sometimes when you have your paper down flat on the table, you're going to be seeing like a parallax, and then you could have stuff out of proportion and not realize it. So it's important to lift your picture up and look at it straight on. I saw that I had there was some problems with the hand and arm, so I'm fixing that now. Now, a kneaded eraser is really handy when you're working with any sort of chalk, because all you have to do is really press the kneaded eraser to your paper and it lifts it up. Now, kneaded erasers do have kind of like an oil in them, so I typically don't use them on regular watercolor paper, but my drawing paper and this black watercolor paper, where I'm going to be using kind of thick metallic watercolors, it's just fine. So I like to start when I'm doing my splashy dancers with some splashing, because I figure that's kind of the scary part. So if you get that out of the way at the beginning, you're less likely to be timid with it or chicken out at the end. So I find just starting off with some splashes. Now, if I'm working on white watercolor paper and doing that technique, I tend to just splash water and then drip some colors into the water, and then it helps me kind of fill the area I want to fill and guide the paints where I want it to go. The metallic watercolors are heavier, so it doesn't, they don't flow quite as well. I apologize if you hear some crazy noises in the background. I think my neighbors are like using a chainsaw or something. I'm using different shades of pinks and purples. I really like these Paul Rubin metallic watercolors because you get a really good variety of colors in the 24 set, and they're all super opaque and glistening. So that's my pick for a large variety of metallic watercolors. Now, the only downside is the pans are kind of small, so if you do want to use a big brush, like a big flat brush, that's not going to fit in those pans, so it's a little bit more of a hassle to use those versus like one of the larger panned varieties out there. For the skin tone, I'm using a variety of kind of like gold and copper and white colors, and I'm just kind of varying the mix depending on how highlighted the area I am painting is. Another option, if you didn't have metallic watercolors, would be to use gouache or another opaque medium. You could definitely use acrylic paints if you wanted to water them down. That would work just fine. The only thing to keep in mind if you're using acrylic paints versus gouache or metallic watercolors is that when you put that color down and it dries, you won't be able to move it again. So just keep that in mind. You could totally do this painting on, say, like a a black canvas if you're using acrylic paints, or this would be so cute in like a little girl's room. You could do this on like a toy box or anything like that with the background painted black. I think things like this are just so fun, especially if you had like a steamer trunk or a little an armoire or a I don't know, any sort of like chest where, you know, kids could keep their dress up clothes or their dance costumes if they're dancers. I think this would be so sweet. And it's actually very easy to paint. If the drawing has got you intimidated, what you could always do is, and I will link the reference photo that I use down below, you could always print out that reference photo and trace it or transfer it to the size you need and then just paint it, because there's really just strokes and splashes of color. There's nothing really advanced or difficult to do like this. I think the drawing is probably the most tricky part about this whole process, just getting kind of the shapes and the lines right. But it's a lot of fun. It's really a lot of fun when you get it right. Now here I'm kind of fussing with the bodice of the dress because I didn't feel like I had the highlights right, and I'm just adding a little bit more blue in there because I don't know, I just wasn't really happy with the way it looked before, and I'm just making sure that I get enough metallic sheen here and there. Now to bring out some of the details, I'm just using a black pen, and these are fine liners. They are waterproof when dry, so if I want to go back in with watercolor, I don't have to worry about it smearing and ruining anything. You could also use like a Sharpie or an acrylic paint pen, something like that. So, you know, just look at what you have. You can usually substitute with a lot of these mixed media techniques. I'm using this brush micron or like fine liner. It's the same ink, it's just got like a brush end, and I'm using that to kind of clean up edges. And if I've got any fuzzy edges or the paint like flowed into some wet area and made the lake too thick, I'm just kind of refining there a little bit. And if I have a shape off, I can just kind of go in and kind of carve away at what I've painted there. So don't feel like you're done. If you're not happy with something, if something is too thick or kind of spilled outside of the lines, you can totally fix that. Mixed media is wonderful because if you have something that you want to do that can't be accomplished in your original media, you can use something else that will work a lot better. So now I'm also putting in some shadows. I don't think the pen is the best idea for the shadows. I think like a color pencil or a pastel pencil, something like that would be a lot easier to use because it's not quite as harsh. And sometimes when you're in there with a real harsh black like that and you're trying to get a subtle shading, it's not going to look that great. But any place you want to have that dark impact or you want to have those really dark lines, the pen works really well because it's going to stay put where you put it. If you do need to soften something out, while it's still dry, you just kind of smudge it with your finger, you can do that as well. I'm putting in her eyebrows and just a little detail around the eye to suggest where her eyes are. If you get too thick with that line, you can either blend it out with a damp brush while it's still wet, or you could go in and paint over it after it dries. So try not to worry about it. The reason the pen is nice is because if you're on that paper when it dries, you'll be able to paint over it. It shouldn't resist your paint, so you're not completely stuck. If you decide that you put some black in there and you didn't like it, you can paint over it, especially with the metallic watercolors, which adhere a lot better than traditional watercolors for some reason. And there you can see where I added it and I wanted it softer, so I just went in with a damp brush and just kind of spread it out a little bit. And I'm going to do that on the top of the other leg because I want the shadows to kind of match. Just one leg like that on its own looks a little harsh. Now this will mix in with your paint underneath when you're adding the water because it's not permanent until it dries. So just kind of keep that in mind. You don't want to lift up all that paint underneath. Although I will tell you, because the paper is black, anytime you lift it up, you're going to get a darker impression because you're going to be lifting off paint and the black paper is going to show through, versus when you lift off on white paper, you get a highlight because the white paper shows through. So you can use that to your advantage as well. It's kind of strange working on black paper when you've been used to working on white paper because the properties are kind of reversed. It's kind of like looking at a photo negative. All your darks and lights are completely reversed, and even colors are opposite. So it's just kind of neat. It's kind of nice, I think, to put your brain in a different situation so that you can you can find some creative fixes. Another thing I like to do is use a pure white gel pen. It's fun for doing like the crepey folds in the skirt, and it can give you a lot of energy and movement when you add the white gel pen. Adding some black colored pencil to do a little bit of shading. Generally, I wouldn't use black on a watercolor frequently, but because I've got the black paper, it totally works. It doesn't seem jarring or harsh because we've already got that value in that color in there on the paper. Now your black paper, it's black, but it's not as black as say a black pastel or a black pen. So you may notice that when you put something down that your black pen or your black pastel or your black pencil is a little bit darker. You'll also notice that the sheen on like India ink or the sheen on a black colored pencil is going to be different than the matte texture of the paper. So that's something that I noticed, but you'll see how I fixed that in a little bit. I actually just took a black Conte crayon, which is kind of like it's a chalky pastel, but it's a very hard pastel, so it doesn't get dusty. I was able to use that to kind of get some darker spots in the background and some energy lines, and also to kind of distract from any differences in surface sheen throughout the paper. So don't be afraid to go in there with your black media and just have fun and just experiment. This reminds me kind of like a Velvet Elvis because you've got that bright the bright color on that black matte paper. You got bright reflective color against the black matte paper, which I think just looks really fun. Now here is that black Conte crayon, which is basically a really hard chalky pastel. I think it does have a little bit of a wax binder in it because it's not dusty at all, but it's not so much like an oil pastel. It's definitely more like a chalk. And I'm just kind of scribbling to add some energy to kind of go with the splashes, but a little bit more subtle. And I really like the way that turned out. It was a lot of fun to paint. It didn't take me too long, and it was just a neat way to use some supplies I have on hand. So if you have metallic watercolors or metallic acrylics and you've got some black paper, give it a shot. It's so much fun, and sometimes it just breaks you out of your comfort zone and gives you some new ideas to use old supplies. I hope you enjoyed this today. If so, please give me a thumbs up and let me know if you plan on trying a project like this in your studio. Feel free to experiment and substitute whatever you have so that you can make it work for you. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, happy crafting.